So it's exactly 0:00 on the dot. Should I start or do you want to wait? Sepang? Oh, okay. Okay, should I go?
Please. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Okay, hello everyone. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the PubGen Africa Harambee Science and Society Cafe. So my name is Alice Matimba, and I'm from Welcome Connecting Science, which is based in the UK. And I'm really honored to be your moderator for today's Science for Society Cafe, which will cover topics around a vision for genetics and data science in medicine in Africa, bridging disciplines, academic transformation, and activism. So I hope you've all had a chance to just get a brief about what this topic is about. And really the goal of this cafe is to have an open discussion on how academic departments and research organizations that are focusing on human genetics could be transformed to lead the genomics and big data in medicine revolution in Africa. So just some housekeeping notes. We hope that this cafe is interactive as possible. We will be having, I will introduce the guest speakers today and just give a bit of brief about them. Then we'll have the speakers give a 10-minute talk. This will be followed by Q&A. Now, these cafes are guided by the African philosophy of Harambee, and that means let us work together for the common good. So we encourage you, all of you, to contribute to the discussion. You can raise your hand if you would like to respond to a question or add a discussion point. You can also use the Q&A box to ask a question, but would also appreciate if you could participate in the polls that will be coming through and share your views or experiences on this topic. And as a reminder for those of you who might need some accreditation, this is accredited by the HPCSA. And if you would like to get some CPD points, please look out for the link in the chat or when it's put up. So we have 3 guest speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Victoria Nambawari. She has a PhD in bioinformatics and is a senior lecturer at the Division of Human Genetics, University of Cape Town. She is also a project manager for Sickle Africa Data Coordinating Center, SADC, and has been involved in quite a lot of activities and projects in H3 Africa, Human Health and Heredity in Africa Consortium, where she was a training manager and set up the H3 Africa Fellowship Program. She also has experience in study design, research design, implementation, study monitoring, and analysis of big data. She is passionate about mentoring and training early career to mid-career scientists, and today she will speak on institutional transformation in human genetic curriculum, training and research, and data science education. After that, we'll have Prof. Colette Dandara, and he's the Deputy Dean of Postgraduate Education at the Faculty of Health Sciences at University of Cape Town. He is Professor of Human Genetics, Principal Investigator of the Pharmacogenomics and Drug Metabolism Research Group at the University of Cape Town, and Director of the Pharmacogenomics Research and Translation Extramural Research Unit of the South African Medical Research Council. He is on the Executive Committee of the African Society for Human Genetics and African Pharmacogenomics Network. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about building capacity and the role of academic activism for advancing genetic medicine and data science in Africa. The third speaker is Professor Michelle Ramsey, who's the director of the Sydney Brenner Institute for Molecular Bioscience at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. She is professor in human genetics and a South African research chair in genomics and bioinformatics of African populations at the University of Wits. She's really, quite actively involved in large-scale projects, collaborating with scientists in Africa and all over the world. And she's also been a key facilitator of the H3 Africa, Human Heritage Genetics in Africa, and leading in some of the main large projects that were looking at advancing African genomics. I will stop there because her profile is much longer than that, but today she'll be speaking about building a sustainable infrastructure and model for genetic medicine and healthcare in Africa. So I'm going to start by inviting Dr. Victoria Nembawari to give us a short talk about the institutional transformation or transformation of institutions and research organizations in implementing genomics and capacity building. Thank you. Victoria, would you like to share your screen? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me participate in this webinar. So I'm going to talk about, the actions or some case studies that we've been building up, which are aiming at institutional transformation of human genetics curriculum and training and data science education. Great. So I think we are, most of us are fully aware that African genomics is really set to change world views and medicine globally. As you can see from the map, instead of the usual view of the globe, our understanding of African genomics will really, alter how we view the globe, and hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to see Africa being viewed this way when the African genomics has been fully appreciated. And that's because once all the knowledge that's being accumulated is going to be transformed into genomic medicine. And on this slide, I just wanted to highlight that initially in Africa, people were really focusing on building human resources in research capacity. But because of the anticipation of African genomic medicine, there is a need to look at upskilling different stakeholders or different human resource capacity in different aspects of African genomic medicine. And to just highlight the data science that's sitting there, because a lot of data is now coming in, which can really inform medicine. Should we also be considering upskilling and making high school learners aware of some of the career choices they have in genomic medicine? At the same time, can we look at healthcare workers who are really part of transforming this? Because as much as institutions have focused on curriculum development for researchers, should they now start looking at all these stakeholders and all humans involved in implementation or translation of the current knowledge? And one of the first steps is, of course, to really crystallize the problem, how much genetic training is happening in Africa. And we're involved in a study or a survey that looked at this. And it was clear that there was limited knowledge in genetics and genomics. There was limited knowledge of actually using existing actionable African-specific knowledge into the clinic. There are limited trainers in Africa or curriculum developers, limited resources. And when we did the survey, only about 33% of participants had institutes that teach genomics and genetics. which was really showing a dearth in this area, which we already knew, but it was great to quantify it. Further crystallizing the problem is an article that looked at data science training in Africa, also highlighting the need to increase this capacity in Africa. And really, when we want to talk about institutional transformation, we want to talk about transformation that changes institutes at many levels, and also that change or transformation should actually spill over to other areas externally, and focus on really transformation and not just far-reaching change, which this quadrant presented here highlights, or adjustments where you're just adjusting, or isolated incidences. And to do that, the first step we thought as a group, and in many networks that we've been involved in, is to really build this capacity en masse across the continent, instead of focusing on just one institute. So the first case study is the one where the aim was to really increase genetics, literacy in genetics for healthcare workers with this African Genomic Medicine Training Initiative. This really involved pooling expertise and engaging widely. As much as we want institutions to change, it was really engaging all institutes at a very wide scale. And the expertise brought in as well highlights the diverse range of areas or thematic areas that could be brought into training. And another factor that we thought was important is actually to really immerse all the implementation and everything we do in training in evidence-based training or implementation. And in this case, we used a framework-informed approach. And as I mentioned before, training en masse as many people as possible to increase awareness, which will then filter into the institutes. In the first round of training in 2017, we had 225 people being trained. But in the fourth iteration in 2023, we had 840, increasing from nurses right through to doctors and laboratory technicians. And another element is to start at grassroots. Instead of focusing on institutional transformation in universities, start at grassroots. And starting at grassroots, this case study aimed at increasing genetics literacy and career options for high school learners. And we're hoping that by increasing this transformation at grassroots levels, it will then filter up to the university or institutes of higher learning. And these are just screenshots of the process of that, where genomic researchers have increased engagement, activities, and information exchange with the youth. And I think one of the crux is also looking at one of the problem areas that has been clearly crystallized is the lack of trainers. And an initiative that was recently started a few years ago by the African Society of Human Genetics in partnerships with the JAX lab in the US under the Makuski short course and the Wellcome Connecting Science is building capacity of the trainers, and not only in their knowledge of genomics and data science skills, but also in how to teach, because knowledge of genomics and genetics does not always mean that you know how to teach. And this training academy was launched, and the training of the trainers has been ongoing, with cohorts traveling to the US. And as soon as funding is available, this will now be translated into a practical training and curriculum development, which we hope will actually light up the entire Africa with changing and increasing capacity in human genetics knowledge through robust curricula developed by Africans. Thank you. I think I will end here for now.
Thank you, Dr. Nembawari. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the Q&A section. and we may respond to them directly, or we can hold them till we've had our last speaker. So please hold on to your questions, but also add them as we go in the Q&A section. Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Colette Dandara, who's going to be talking about building capacity and role of academic activism for advancing genomics and data science in Africa. Thank you. Welcome, Professor Dandara.
Can you see my slide, Alice?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I will sort that out. Okay, so I have only 2 slides. So thank you very much.
Sorry, Colette is showing your presenter screen. Would you like to just switch the windows?
If you know.
Go to where it says, oh no, I don't know.
Okay,
I can't see on you, but it's okay. We can see. I think it's.
Let me do this. What do you see now?
We see everything, but it's not in presenter mode.
It's not in presenter mode. Okay, let me try to put it in presenter mode now. Do you see now in presenter mode?
You need to start the presenter mode.
Okay, let me do that again. Sorry for that. Let's share this one. And now can you see? If it doesn't work, Alice, I will just talk. Don't worry. Yeah. If you can, yeah.
It's okay.
Can you see?
We can
Lovely.
see. We can see it.
Okay. It's okay because I'll be just talking on those 2 slides. So my task really is to talk about capacity and role of academic activism for advancing genetic medicine. So I really want to thank the organizers for this session. So I want to start just by highlighting that it is very important that we premise that the data we're talking about in genetic medicine is genetics data and its integration with other data that actually then becomes useful in genetic medicine. We can talk about other data such as data that you can glean from social media, some data that you can glean from your smartwatches, but it only becomes useful when you put it together, when you integrate it together with the underlying genetics. But to come into the idea of capacity, Vicky has spoken about the training that is happening, has spoken about some of the projects that are being done, but it is important to premise this on the continent in terms of Africa to really look at how important the capacity for us to utilize data science is going to be. When you look at that, the continent actually harbors about a quarter of the burden of disease in the world. However, a startling statistic is that it is a continent that has got the youngest population. In 2022, it was shown that the median age in Africa is 18.8 years, which actually really shows that the potential in terms of the use of data, the use of technologies that are going to be used to get data, there's a huge potential. But what I would want also to really emphasize is that because of the young population, there is a possibility that we are able to really utilize or leapfrog other countries such that we don't have to go through the processes that they went through in terms of setting up, let's say, their systems. We can actually bypass some of these systems. For example, there's a huge or wide use of mobile phones in Africa that can actually be tapped into in terms of quickly looking at surveillance as well as early warning systems, like in the case of pandemics. But we still, regardless of all the projects that have been done, we know H3 Africa has been spoken about, a huge contribution in terms of decoding the African genomes. However, we are still very much underrepresented in terms of the current data sets that are out there. So there's a huge potential for people to really research much more. For example, if you look in conditions such as, just to mention a few, like metabolic syndromes, if you look at what we call the normal values that are normally set and all that, the data that we use is largely derived from other populations. So the use of data and also understanding its intersection with the genetics would be quite very helpful. But also in terms of capacity, what is important is that I think we must start to move towards encouragement of adoption of electronic medical records. But it must not just end in terms of just electronic medical records. We must also look at the harmonization of the data that is collected. Because currently, if you look at the I know the setup of Data Science Africa and all that, the data that can be collected from old data sets sometimes has got a lot of gaps that are not usable. So as part of building usable data sets for the future, we must advocate that we set up standards of the minimum data sets that must be collected. One of the areas that we must look at, if we look at both the healthcare and the research data, is that sometimes we make too much of a distinction between data that is collected for healthcare and the one that is collected for research. And it becomes difficult in future than now when you want to go back and use that data because different parameters would have been collected. What we need then also to look at is to say, even if at present, some of the data that is being collected in the clinics, in the healthcare facilities, has not been ethically approved in terms of the governance to be used for research, I think we must agree on the minimal variables that must be collected, such that when the governance allows, that data can be used. So I think that's one of the areas that we should look at. And then just to conclude in terms of activism, I think we know most of our African populations in terms of rare conditions where there's a lot of myths about what are causing all those rare conditions. We as geneticists must actually get into the communities. We can do this. Vicky has been talking about the high school projects and about also training by identifying students who come from different communities, training them, and then asking them to be advocates for genetics in the communities that they are coming from, so that we start to debunk the issue about genetic diseases, so that communities can start to understand the basis of genetic diseases. So I think I just wanted to put that there, but we will touch on some of the aspects as part of a response to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Danbara. So our third and final speaker is Professor Michelle Ramsey, and she'll be talking about building a sustainable infrastructure and model for genomic medicine in healthcare in Africa. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, and thank you for making me part of this Harambee Science and Society Cafe. I'm really looking forward to the discussions that will happen afterwards. So as Alice has indicated, my task is really to talk about how do we build a sustainable model for genomic medicine and healthcare in Africa. And, I think for many of us, we use genomic medicine and precision medicine as if they are synonyms. And maybe to reflect that when we talk about precision medicine, it's far more than genomics. It also includes, all the kind of health data that one can possibly use to try and think about the best possible treatment for a particular patient so that it is tailored not only to their genetics, but also to a lot of other parameters. So I've decided in the 10 minutes that I would just address 3 questions. So really, in terms of genomic medicine in Africa, where are we at the moment? Where do we need to be, and how do we get there? So to address the first one, I wanted to show you this map that was developed through a lot of data gathering by the EU Africa Personalized Medicine Consortium. And they basically looked at different types of information. They looked at whether countries had governance related to genomics, whether there was funding for it, what the resources were, what the publication outputs were, and also how extensively there was international collaboration, and then personalized medicine or genomic research. And the darker the color, the more capacity there is in the country. And so you can see that South Africa and Egypt have more capacity than most countries in Africa, and some really have very little. But there are a number of countries that are up and coming in terms of their capabilities for genomic research. And of course, that is critical when you're thinking about genomic medicine. This was published a few years ago, and it was really trying to look at different service delivery models and which ones are actually, at the moment, present in different African countries. So the things that were looked at were things like, is there a clinical geneticist in a country? Is there access to genetic counseling, or is the counseling only done by the clinical geneticist or the doctor? Is there laboratory infrastructure for confirming a diagnosis, and what kind of capacity is available? Then, can testing be done for cytogenetics and molecular technologies? Then at the next level, is next generation sequencing technologies available? And then, what do the systems look like for diagnosis of genetic disorders and prevention? And what you can see under uncharacterized is that none of that is present. And that is sadly the case in quite a few African countries. But many countries have sort of limited service delivery, where they may have a clinical geneticist, they may have capacity for genetic counseling, they can do confirmatory diagnosis, and they may be able to do some tests. And then when you take it a step further, they may be focused on specific diseases. And for those diseases, they would have good genetic counseling, they would be able to do confirmatory testing, and they would have some kind of infrastructure. And that could, for example, be for sickle cell disease. But then we can go on to emerging, established, and advanced. And what we need is the advanced model, because that will be most effective for the implementation of precision medicine at a sort of country level. So knowing that the balance is shifted to the left is problematic, and what Vicky and Colette have said is really necessary to start moving us to the right. So where do we want to be? We can look at this precision medicine implementation pathway in terms of all the things that we need to do to move ourselves towards having impact on a population level, but also on an individual level. So first of all, we need basic research. And I think this was highlighted, that we need African-related data, and we need new data. As Colette was saying, we can't always use legacy data. We need capabilities for omics, we need good databases, and we need to understand the link between the variant and the phenotype. But we also need to look at the knowledge around societal issues and cultural issues. So we need to have community engagement and to strengthen a language and develop a language around genetics that can be used to speak to communities, and then to understand their attitudes and eventually, how they would access clinical genetic services. When we think about the health infrastructure, we need to think of primary and secondary health centers, but as Vicky was saying, we should really start already at schools. But we want to know that there are, in the health infrastructure, diagnostic laboratories, and ideally a form of health record that can be accessed, and that the patients will actually have access also to services. It is important, if we are addressing a country and looking at change, to also think about feasibility. Like, what is the current health expenditure of a country? How would we implement this? And what would the cost be? And could that be affordable? So eventually, if we want to look at the population health impact, and we want to look at precision public health, we also need to understand disease prevalence. And this is not known in a lot of African countries. We need to know about genetic diversity, because Africa is such a complex continent with populations that are so different. And we need to think about how we can harness this for the best possible outcome for the majority of the people in a country. And then, of course, in terms of precision health or personalized health, we want to see what will the impact be on the individual. So really trying to understand genotype to phenotype is not trivial. And we know now that, many assays that have been developed for European populations may not be appropriate in African populations. So we have to look at that very carefully. And eventually we want to look at prevention, and then also in terms of monitoring the health of individuals. So it's a few years now since the World Health Organization came out with this document about accelerating access to genomics for global health, and emphasizing that genomic technologies are critical for improving health and the livelihood of people in all parts of the world, regardless of their economic status. And of course, this for us immediately makes us think about Africa and how Africa is going to have access. So the themes that they highlighted in this document was, promoting genomic health through advocacy, and implementing genomics, making sure that there's good collaboration and that this is done in an ethically and legally sound way. And I think always that the World Health Organization recommendations are wonderful, but the implementation has to happen at country level. So we can't even think about it at continental level. We have to start thinking about what can be done in our specific countries. So we've thought quite a lot about the ecosystem and how we can accelerate precision medicine on the continent. So you can see that it is about building that translational bridge between research and service delivery. So we know through H3 Africa and many other programs on the African continent that we have quite a lot of research being done. But if we think about clinical genetic services, as I showed you before, there's very little. But that is not enough, and it doesn't work in isolation. It actually works in the broader healthcare system. And it's really important to build these multidisciplinary and clinical networks to actually make sure that one reaches the right patients at the right time. So if we think about those accelerators, it's about data and knowledge, as Colette was saying earlier, but it's also about skills development, as Vicky was saying, and it's at many different levels, because genetics or genomics or genomic medicine is a multidisciplinary endeavor. So we require clinical geneticists who will make the diagnosis, see the patients, possibly inform the treatment. We need the genetic counselors who will speak to the families, to talk to them about reproductive choices. And we need the medical scientists who will be doing the tests in laboratories and also developing new knowledge. We need the lab infrastructure, and we need that supportive healthcare environment. But if our governments don't give dedicated funding to supporting genomic medicine, how will that happen? And therefore we say for this to be sustainable, we really need that political will or national governmental input and commitment to personalized medicine. But I think, we can also talk about public understanding of genomic medicine and think about how the public can help us as advocates and possibly, spreading the message. So how do we get to where we want to be? So this is the last slide, and I just want to unpack a little bit, what my sort of thoughts are about this. That first of all, we all know that we have amazing pockets of excellence for genomic research in Africa. So when I think about that, I think about the areas of pharmacogenomics, rare diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health disorders. There are really good networks across Africa and very good work being done. And then we have a lot of networks, and we need to strengthen those networks. So the ones in black are the ones that already exist, and the ones in blue are the ones that we aspire to have to help us achieve this goal of precision medicine in Africa. So when I think about learned societies, I think about the African Society of Human Genetics and the multiple country-specific societies of human genetics. But we should not forget about all the other societies, whether it's about hematology or cardiology or laboratory science. All of those are necessary and important to strengthen what we think about in terms of personalized precision medicine or genomic medicine. We've already heard about H3 Africa, the Rare Diseases Network, the Pharmacogenomics Network that Colette leads, and then Africa CDC, which traditionally has been doing infectious disease, but is now also branching out into genomic science. And hopefully in the future, we will have funded an African Bioinformatics Institute, the African Genomic Centers of Excellence that we've been hearing about for the last 2 years, and then also most recently, the African Population Cohorts Consortium that can provide us with amazing data to provide insights into common diseases. So the next step would be to identify champions and build strong partnerships. And that we have to do at multiple levels. We need to do it in our individual institutions, but we also need to think about it in terms of national impact. And it's really encouraging that several African countries are now developing their own genome projects, like Tunisia, like Egypt, like Morocco, like South Africa. And I think that's really important. But in Africa, because we have stronger partners and weaker partners, we also need to think about partnerships and looking at Africa in a regional way to make sure that everybody can participate. But very importantly, we also need to look at partnerships with industry because they can be very important enablers for data generation, but also for making sure that African data is represented in their algorithms that they develop to roll out as tests so that people from Africa and in Africa can also benefit. And then I think we really need to think about how can we get more people involved in building small businesses around focusing on genomics and genomic medicine in Africa. So the last part here is to engage national and regional decision makers. And the way that we do that is through our success stories. And we haven't given them to you now, but there are amazing success stories. We then need to think about advocacy and maybe also activism in terms of spreading the message. And if we are able to put monetary value to this, we would be in a better position to actually go to decision makers about the benefits. Colette was talking about, leapfrogging in terms of using technology. But this will only be possible if there is that political will to actually allocate resources to this initiative. And then just saying, again, we need to understand and make sure this is done in a way that is ethical and legal. So we need frameworks, and not all countries have them. We need laboratories, we need biobankings. Most importantly, we need a skilled workforce. And we then also need to really upskill and think about data science and bioinformatics. And fortunately, there are several initiatives now that are looking at this. And we need to do more of that to be able to make a difference. So these are just some thoughts about how we can work towards personalized medicine in the African context. And I think with that, I'll stop sharing and hand back to you, Alice.
Okay, fantastic. I think this has been really, really nice short talks, giving us a broad overview of the activities that have been going on over the last, I guess, 2 decades in Africa. And my first question actually is, because all these are great initiatives, and I wondered where can we get this information so we can have a landscape of what's going on in terms of developing genomics capacity training, and also the initiatives that Prof. Ramsey has just told us about. So that's a question to the 3 of you, actually, and whether there's any resource or a platform that we can be able to see all these initiatives that are ongoing in Africa.
I'm happy to give it a start. So I think there's no one-stop shop. But what we have to say is that H3 Africa, DSI Africa have amazing websites. And Vicky can talk about this more because projects do as well. And, maybe we need to think about, is there one place that people can go to access all of this? Because there's so much of it. So I'm not quite sure how one would go about that and under which umbrella you would put it. Because the EU Africa Personalized Medicine Consortium has, wonderful information available, but you need to kind of search on them. I'll hand over to the others.
Lovely. I think it's a great question. It actually makes me think that there's a gap. I'm part of the CPIC, where CPIC is actually moving, this is international, towards integrating the farm GKB, clean gen, and all that together. We don't have such here. Like Michelle said, there are various places where you can get the information. I think we should start to distill it so that we've got a portal where people can actually go and possibly not necessarily bring all the information, but have links where if they get to that portal, they can get the links to the other places where the data is. I think it's something that we should look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a really good question, as highlighted, and definitely the current initiatives, unfortunately, most of the activities to try and pull information together is not sustainable, because most of the time it's housed under a soft-funded project like H3 Africa or H3 Bionet or DS Africa. I remember when I was still working for under H3 Bionet, we developed a catalog called the eGenomics catalog. And the whole purpose was actually to have a one-shop place where someone could go and find training information on anything that is related to genomics. And as you know, most things are related to genomics. And there was actually like an ontology as well that was used to actually categorize the different places, including events and so on. So I think if that could be taken under a sustainable body, like the African Society or a university, so that it continues being sustained, I think that then we can have something that encompasses everything. But I think that's a very good idea. And it's something I think that we can put as an action item to look at sustainability of some of these resources and catalogs that we produce. Thanks.
And that brings me to, to follow on with a comment around, how having, how genomics needs to be better embedded in institution, in academic or research organizations, particularly universities. So we talk about sustainability, And my question is, how can, where everybody sort of gets the initial training, we hope, on genomics, how can this be done more effectively? A lot of genomics training and initiatives, like you said, they're soft-funded projects, they're parts of organizations, so which means that sort of like stand alone or stand outside of the core curriculum. And so my question is, any one of you can answer, and maybe the audience as well, how can genomics education, so before we even go to training where we're looking primarily at professionals, how can we better embed genomics into a university education in Africa? Colette, you're on mute.
Thank you, Alice. This is a very interesting question, quite important. I will just reflect with, in 2011, when I started just looking at the aspect of education, when I started to recruit students who were coming from different universities for our honors program, I saw a huge gap in just in the same country in terms of the education that they went through. But as long as I can remember, we have never had a platform where we sit as educationists in genetics in the country to just look at the level at which we are teaching and what we are teaching in genetics. Everyone is doing what they think is the right thing. So I think one of the things we should do as human genetics training centers or divisions is to really bring each other together and set minimum standards for particular levels that we think people should exit with, that they've acquired. We have not done that, but I'm still thinking we can do that. I would really want to be part of that initiative where we go around the country, and then that can then be spread out across the continent to say our students move from one country to the other. So if they have to articulate from one university to another, this is the minimum we require for them to be able to move seamlessly in the region. That's yeah, thank you very much for that question.
Prof. Colette. Michelle?
So I think it's so important to make sure that the health professionals are also trained. I think we tend to focus mostly on research, but I think it's, you know, at all the different levels. And in Africa, there are only a few countries who have, for example, a course in genetic counseling. And I think already we are doing kind of cross-learning, but I don't know, you know, it's getting back to that political will that you need posts for people, because we've been frustrated also in training, and then people can't find jobs, and then they leave if they want to continue practicing their profession. So I think, you know, we have a systemic thing that we need to address. So that ecosystem, we need to think about how to reach more of it. But I think, you know, we have amazing opportunities because there are clinicians who really are interested in genetics and genomics, and we need to kind of not necessarily us do it, but inspire them to want to do it, because we can't influence the medical curriculum. But if we speak to the deans and get them to do it, because, you know, we actually wrote a textbook in 2009 called Molecular Medicine for Clinicians, because at the time when we looked at the existing textbooks, they were all so Eurocentric and they didn't have examples that were appropriate to our setting. So, you know, do we need to do an ebook that is accessible to medical schools across the continent? You know, I think we can really brainstorm interesting approaches. Those are just some thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to, oh, sorry, go on, Victoria, if you want to say something.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I just wanted to emphasize that I totally agree about the need for equity and for some standards in the education of genomics across the continent. But at the same time, I think we should also be fully appreciate that you cannot have all experts sitting in one university. And we could look at how best to to pool expertise so that we can actually have strong training curricula in the different universities. But I think another aspect about this training is really the train-the-trainer approach, so that we make sure that the people we want to teach genomics are really competent in it, and make sure that there are centers to train the trainers for that. And interestingly, I think when I look at the US model, they've got people who just do research and there are people who just train. And we do not have enough maybe positions of people who are interested in just education in genomics to actually create posts just for them, or education research. It's very few universities that are supporting that. And I think this is a key aspect that we could work on to make sure that we create positions for education personnel experts in the genomics field who can push that agenda and research and implementation of just training in that area. Yeah, so I think I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see one of the biggest barriers indeed is, having those, positions or, within the universities, that being one of the major barriers. Are there any, so I'll pivot a little bit just to, go still on the same issue around barriers. What do you think, other than the not having positions and professorial positions and so forth, what other barriers are, impact having that culture of developing those, the models, so that you've all presented really good models, and there's mention of, there are no resources and there's no money and so forth. But I'd like to come to this from a culture perspective in terms of universities or the people that make decision makers or in countries. What are some of those barriers or cultural barriers that prevent some of these initiatives or models being implemented across different organizations, research academic universities in Africa?
Michelle, will you take it? Amazing.
I don't know, I can think that one of the barriers is data, that we don't have enough information. Because, for example, if you want to look at prevalence of mutations, that sort of thing, there's not a lot of data. And Africa is so diverse that we know that solutions that we might find for West Africa may not translate well to other parts of Africa. So we can't have data sets just in one region. When we look at HapMap and the 1,000 Genomes Project, although there are 5 continental African populations, they're sort of mostly West African with one in East Africa. So people don't really know. So I think that's a barrier. Then, maybe another barrier is also that we're not networking effectively enough, but that's a very hard thing to do. And maybe it's also that we need the healthcare professionals to be the ones who are networking. And I'm really excited that there's now like a genetic counseling Africa group. Vicky, you might want to talk about that a little bit, but also for the pharmacogenomics, so I think those are things that we should be strengthening.
Yeah.
If I can add, I think, Michelle, you touched on a very important aspect. One of the things that you see also access to data is that we appear to be over restrictive in Africa in terms of access to data. Yet we don't even have the necessary information. What do we want for people to access the data? So it's almost a regulation to the extent of not just permitting, not because we've got layers of things that you must follow. We say No, you just cannot do it. So it goes back to advocacy to say, because I can tell you, I had a student who was coming from Malawi trying to work on a genetic problem in Malawi. To get access to be allowed to do that and bring samples to Cape Town in South Africa, it was just a nightmare. And when you ask them, what should we follow that you want us to do, there's no framework. They just don't. So I think maybe we must work on the advocacy. Let's work on the public good. So that at least we're on some level that certain things there is no stigma that is attached to it. Maybe we can push it back to us as researchers to say maybe we should work at very high ethical levels, so that we earn this trust from communities across Africa. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Vicky, you want to add?
Yeah, so I think a point that has been highlighted by both speakers really is our lack of engagement with some key stakeholders. And I think as Colette mentioned, it's at high levels, politicians who actually, make enabling policies. Maybe we are not engaging enough with them. The patient groups that we get the data from, are we also engaging and educating them and training them about the importance of consenting to data to be used for training, So I think that lack of engagement is highlighted in a lot of, as Colette mentioned, is a lot of mistrust when people don't want to release their data. But at the same time, I think I will just pick up on what Michelle was mentioning about the need for champions, that we need to create champions in specific areas who then can push the genomics and genetics agenda. And in this case, the African Society has taken a kind of new approach of saying, can we create champions and sub-networks of genetic counselors, of people interested in pharmacogenomics, in craniofacial and dental aspects. And when you create these champions, then you're developing capacity in a very specific way, and also that will, I think, increase the case studies that we badly need, which Michelle was highlighting, in terms of the training that we do, that the training becomes relevant and is tailored to the African problems and needs, and also driven by the people on the continent, because the dental and craniofacial groups, they've got a webinar series that is really, gaining momentum, and people are learning more about the genetics of dentistry, which is fascinating and is bringing up questions that were never asked before on the continent and maybe globally. So I think building those networks and champions really is something that we can continue doing. But I also wanted to highlight another thing, or emphasize it again and again. In most of the universities, you get someone who's lecturing, who's doing admin work, who is developing curriculum. No, they're also supervising students, they're running a company, or let's add to that, they are also heading this society and that society. And, so I think we sometimes overload people. And I think it's really key to develop professionals focusing on genomics training. And those professionals really focus on panel beating the curriculum. And so I think that lack of appreciation of the need for someone to just be a specialist is really important. And I think another barrier is that, and maybe it's an opportunity for us, that we have had so many networks of education, people who are interested in education. And with the Genomic Medicine Summit training, group that was recently created, I think it's an opportunity for us as a region to create our own network, which then feeds to the global network. Instead of things coming from the global perspective, we do a from Africa approach to the global. So I think this is an opportunity, and we are hoping that we can discuss this further, especially with the African society, so that we can actually establish that in a very formal way. And I have dedicated people who are pushing that agenda.
Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
In fact, I'm quite, I think there's a general, sort of like network envy of in Africa, because it seems Africa is the one region where there are a lot of really strong networks. There are a lot of networks, but they're actually really strong. And I think it's a model that I think other regions also can benefit from. So sometimes instead of just doing things for Africa, for Africa, and Africans, I think it's important to actually realize that there are a lot of really advanced initiatives that could be applicable even for other regions as well. So and so there are quite a few questions in our Q&A. And I just want to start, I'll pick a couple of them, but I think some of them might already be answered. There's this question that, or a comment from someone who's says, I'm in awe and proud of what has been achieved in Africa and the progress in establishing genomics. For many reasons, there is movement of trained staff out of Africa. I think we all know about that. And so the question is, how can we leverage the diaspora network, or the diaspora network of skilled professionals? How can we tap into their expertise? A lot of them have been trained in Africa. I'm one of those. and I'm out here. So how can we better leverage that expertise and make it, probably my question is, how can it be more formalized? As you know, I think most people want to come back, want to work with their people from the countries where they were coming from, but there aren't any clear mechanisms of doing that. So how can this be done? And from just over to you, your perspectives on that.
Yeah. So I think, would you like to take it, Colette? I see your mic is off.
No. You start.
Yeah. So I think brain drain is like was a big issue. And looking at that, I think there are many different models we could look into, and even look at examples of people who have managed to be in diaspora and still contribute a lot. And one aspect is in capacity development, because many times if there's a method or something that has been developed overseas and you are part of the initiative there, you can always look back and be a trainer on the African continent to build capacity. And I think I know a couple of high-level scientists who have two maybe appointments, one overseas and another one here. And the one in Africa is mainly for capacity development. So I think that's a model that can be looked at and maybe promoted, especially even for grant writing. Sometimes you need a collaborator who's elsewhere to strengthen maybe missing elements of your own grant. So I think there are many various models, but I think this also starts from developing these networks regionally, so that when people leave, they still feel connected to the continent, and they still feel like they can give back. So I think I'm really in support of strengthening and continuing with our networking from very young, upcoming young investigators, so that they create friendships that go beyond just a single project, that are lifelong. Yep,
Okay.
I would stop there.
Michelle?
That's really great, Vicky. And just to say, Alice, you're a great example of how you're giving back to Africa. So thank you for that. The only thing I wanted to add to Vicky was, I'm getting fascinated by this whole idea of twinning. And, for instance, laboratory science is not trivial, and setting up genetic tests. And if there are people in the diaspora who, really want to invest time and effort, if they could then twin with a lab in an African country about, sort of training and helping them sort of develop. And that can happen at different levels. And there's already a program which Amanda Kraus and colleagues are involved with. I think it's with the Netherlands, or it may be Belgium. It's about what the program is, that you have a clinician and a laboratory person in the one country partnered with a clinician and a laboratory person in the other country, and they work together and learn together. And I think, that is one way of doing it, because it's very hard sometimes to do it on a group level. So on a one-to-one level, I think can be really powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess in terms of how can institutions support this kind of work? Is there room for that? Or is it yet another thing to worry about?
I loved what Vicky was saying, that, as African scientists, we often expected to be everything to everybody. And it's really hard because there are more opportunities than any one of us can embrace, and they're just so few. So I think that's one of our real limitations. I think there's no lack of will. It's more lack of enough people to engage and to be able to do it. So yeah, lots of things to do.
Yeah. Indeed. So there's a question, actually. I think this could be for Michelle. So I was wondering if we could develop African population indigenous knowledge and awareness for precision medicine as a program, rather than following the European relatively homogeneous population model.
I love that question, because I think it's so relevant. And that we need to keep on reminding people that Africa is not a country, it's not a single group, that there's so much that we have to look at. And, I'm kind of thinking that sometimes our message isn't clear enough, because people talk about people with African ancestry. And, we need to think about, what does that mean? And they even use it for people on the continent. And then I'm thinking, but is this really appropriate? Because they're Africans. So, of course they have African ancestry, but it seems to be used mostly when they're admixed people and they have a little bit of African, but then also the African part that they have may be more West African than it is East African or South African. And what we've realized through our work on population genetics across the continent is that, they're not discrete units. When you look at populations across the continent and you do your principal component analysis or your population structure, you see continuums, and that everybody has multiple African ancestries. So how do we think about that, and how do we think about that in the context of precision medicine? And do we need to start, sort of just aggregating genomes and looking at, which regions are from which origins, and does that impact in terms of our interpretation? So I think, there's so much for us to think about. And I think there are groups that are looking, even at polygenic scores for complex diseases, and thinking about, how you need to develop the score in people with multiple ancestries. But then when they do that, it's like 95% European and 5% African. And so it's not expected to work well for Africans. And the African component there may be only of one region of the continent. So I think we have a lot to think about and a lot to do.
So thank you. So my next question is about data science. And so I'm asking this because, first of all, maybe if we can have a quick explanation of what is data science and how that is related to genomics. And the next question is, how can institutions prepare themselves for this upcoming revolution, which is inevitable. But we all know that it's important and everybody has to jump on the bandwagon, but our institutions prepared, our universities prepared for this, not only in terms of using it, doing it, but also training on it? If anyone wants to answer that.
Maybe I can start by saying, when you look at data science, I think we've moved into the realm of massive data. These data sets that usually, if you look at it at the center of it, you have got very powerful machines that must actually be computing that data. And where the algorithms you're looking at, it can either be public or private, but it's massive. For example, you can look at data that is generated per person per day on their smartphone. If you have to harness that data, and if you want them to use that data to track the person in terms of their lifestyle and look at whether there is a cause or effect in terms of their genetics and the data that we are getting. So, for example, public health could make very much good use of social media data in terms of just looking at following events, looking at what is being said on social media and what are the likelihood that there's an outbreak somewhere, in terms of that data. So not all the data science that we're talking about is genetics data, but it is usually when we then look at genetic medicine, we're saying what is the intersection now with your underlying genetics, for example, your health, or your, let's say, your lifestyle, what you do, does that have any bearing with your underlying genetics? So it's quite, I think it is very much talks to the concept of One Health as well. If you have to bring in other, like human and animal and plant health, to say, how can we use all this massive data together to get a picture, almost like geographical information mapping of variation that is happening in space. That's how big. I just want to show how massive we should start thinking. It's not like the little data points. It's something that you can't let's say explain in one dimension, but in several dimensions that needs a powerful computation. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry, Vicky or Michelle?
Oh, I was going to add to what Colette was saying, that, we sort of entering the age of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And, you need a lot of data to do that. But it also depends on what data you have, because you cannot ask a question if you haven't got the relevant data to put in. So what I've noticed is that a lot of AI models for predicting health actually don't have genetic data in them. And, these are groups in Oxford and Cambridge and Yale and Harvard. And, maybe we should be asking them to think about, how do you include genetics? So I think, there are a few groups who come more from the genetic side, who are doing polygenic scores and then including variables, as Colette was saying, about health, because I think we all realize now that for complex diseases, it's not enough to look at the genetics. You have to look at the environment. You have to look at the gene environment interactions, but also the gene interactions. And, that is all necessary. So I think those are worldwide difficult questions. And then the question is, can we in Africa work in those areas? Can we add something unique because of the unique variation that we have? So I think developing skills and capabilities in data science are really important. And, I just loved what Colette said. We are a young continent, and we're going to have a lot more people. And young people are the ones who are wrapping their heads around the data science problem.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. I have a question here around, I guess it could be advocacy or activism. And so my question is there a place, apologies, there's some noise in the background. Is there a place for scientific activism? And this is for Colette, is there a place for scientific activism to advance genetics or genomic medicine agenda in Africa? And what would that look like for other scientists like yourselves, or early and mid-career scientists?
That's an interesting question, but if I can say, Alice, yes, there is space. One of the things that you can do because activism works in terms of you also want to advocate for people to know, and one of the easiest is to pick what people already know, but they don't understand what is happening with it. We can look at issues around albinism. If we could really look at the albinism and champion the genetics around it, people know about that. So rare conditions are very, very good examples where you can pick a rare condition now with sequence, find a mutation. If it can be cured, I can give an example where in Boston, a child was born with a condition that they had almost Huntington features, they had ataxia features, they had several features. But one of the researchers sequenced that baby, found a mutation, and then they applied antisense oligonucleotide therapy. And that baby actually, the condition was reversed. So they ended up calling the approach melanasia because the child was called Melanie. So you can use those examples if you pick. Sometimes we say if you have got to bridge the policy gap, if we have got we know our politicians, there are some who might have actually family members who are affected. If we could do good science, pick to them where you can really show the power of science. That will change a lot if there are people in power or people with money who see the power of science. So there is room. I think we just need to move away from a lot of things that we're doing, but I think we need different people to be looking at different aspects so that activism is one of the things that we look after every day. We have not been doing it, and we must do that. Yeah.
Indeed. Okay, so we are almost reaching the end of today's session, but before we move on to the wrapping up part of this session, we have a couple of questions for you. So if we can have, is it Osipeng? Do a couple of polls. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there are some questions here. I guess we have to scan the QR code or enter anything on the email so we can answer. Okay. So the question is, what do you see as the most significant challenge in bridging the gap between genetics research and clinical practice in Africa? So some of the discussion, we've discussed some of this.
Unless this is now for the audience, isn't it? And it's not for
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry, I didn't introduce that. Is it how much time are we giving?
Okay, I think if everyone manages to scan the QR, then it will lead them to Mentimeter. Then yeah, 2 minutes.
So Colette, you can
It needs to
definitely,
change. Oh, sorry, go on.
yeah, no, I was saying Colette can answer it. So I've put something in.
Yeah.
It worked very well.
But it doesn't change. I think you have to change the slide so that
Yes.
people.
So we have to scan every slide.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I will do a round of the slides again so that everyone who missed them, they can scan. So I'm going back to slide 1 or before 4.
So Alice, I think there is a suggestion that we can continue the conversation as people complete the polls. And I was wondering whether I could just add something around advocacy.
Yes.
That I think, yes, because I work with the sickle cell consortium, and looking back, one of the biggest advocate for sickle cell was the First Lady of Congo. And my understanding is that she had a child with sickle cell disease. And that's how she advocated for World Sickle Cell Day to be established and recognized globally. And I'm wondering whether that could be an opportunity for researchers to do the same, but also really base the advocacy on evidence. Evidence from research, evidence from policy briefs, and maybe there's now a gap for us to train people in implementation research in kind of the genomics area, so that they can also help translate and push the advocacy role or agenda, and especially when they can get champions who are sitting in strategic positions and who have a personal story to tell about particular diseases, because I think people can relate better to that. And I think we have not fully tapped into funding mechanisms other than the usual, national funders like NHLBI and so on. We haven't really gone into private families, trust funds, because a lot of them are not even fully aware of genomics and genetics. So I think a lot of advocacy work needs to be done in terms of actually raising funding for research through patient groups or champions in genetics who we can collaborate with as researchers and as trainers.
Right. That's a really good point. Yes, you do find that a lot of there are other funding opportunities other than the traditional funders that people are not aware of it, but also those opportunities are not clear because they are not aware of, of our needs or interests rather. So yeah, I agree that it will be good to explore some of those opportunities.
Maybe just to add to that as well, Alice, is I don't think we do enough cross-disciplinary work.
Yeah.
And, science communication is almost like a field in itself. And partnering with people in media studies or science communication. And, I think Vicky is right that personal stories are enormously powerful, but we may not be the best people to get that message across. So do we need, filmmakers? I also am interested that often in soap operas and so on, they use genetic examples. And I think that's a great way of getting the message across. Hopefully, mostly they do kind of check in with geneticists to make sure they've got the story right. But, can we do more of that? Can we influence that informal understanding of genetics and the issues? Because they often also bring the soft issues about ethics, about decision-making, about reproductive health and so on into the conversation. And that's a great hook, to then bring people into the science.
You're absolutely right, Michelle. I think we're not working with the right people to send the message across. We don't have enough people who are trained in those communication skills. And in fact, it answers one of the questions I had about how can we raise more awareness? How can we have people be more aware about genomics and and the impact it can have on health? And before we close off, we've talked about, there are many programs that are taking place on the continent, many case studies of case models of how genomics could be done in Africa, but there are not very many case studies on how genomics has been or is or can be translated into practice. And I think there are probably a few of those, and I wondered how we can, I would like to hear your views about how we can improve the efforts to coordinate the various stakeholders, bring in all these multidisciplinary-ness to genomics research. I think we might think we're doing it, but I'm not sure it is optimal. So I want to get your views about that.
Yeah. So Alice, if I can get into that in terms of how we are positioning genomics and also the advocacy and all that. I think we must be very intentional and start, because we've got the power, we are hiring people, we look for someone we want someone who's got bioinformatics. We want someone who's got biostatistics. We want a medical geneticist. We've never said that we want someone who is able to communicate genetics. So to create it as a post, those who are leaders in human genetics division, to say, this position, we are looking for someone who is able to be talking to politicians and of course, like what Alice says, Vicky has said in terms of the science must be right, you must be talking the correct science, but it's their job. So they're day to day, they wake up and they go home, they come back, they're thinking about how can I promote genetics? We don't look it as a post, we do it as part-time, as a by the way. So that's how I have ignited some thinking in me to say, really, we must reconfigure the current posts we have and start to consider new ideas if we want this to work. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think I just want to emphasize another point again to respond to your question, is that the implementation research aspect. We have been generating research, but translating that has been lagging because also we don't have enough implementation researchers in the field, or even in the universities, there aren't too many of those. But I think another aspect which we shy away from in the African academic institutes is promoting that researchers create commercial companies. And, you know, when you go to like Ivy League, like Stanford and so on, almost every student there has got a little company going on the side. But this is not something that we promote. And I think we should really actively do that, because there are lots of, the person who created it, if they can partner with a business partner, or the university gives support for these incubators, or even to train them to realize when an idea can be commercialized. Because there are lots of ideas that can be commercialized, but because the people who promote the creation of like you know, startup companies are sitting in one side of the university and the researchers in another, I think we also need to find some way of bridging the two departments together to push innovative companies to be established.
Indeed, Vicky. So yes, so we've stimulated some really good conversations, and we're just getting to the end of our time today of this cafe. And so I want to thank everyone that attended, and I would also like to thank the panelists and also the PubGen organizing team for setting up this this wonderful cafe. There have been some really stimulating discussions that have also got me thinking differently, and I think that's the idea, to come together and share. So on that note, I want to remind you that this is one of a series of cafes, and so in the spirit of Harambee, we hope that you will join the second part of this series, and also any other PubGen cafes that will come up in the future. And if you want to have any more information, I think some information has been added to the chat. You can follow PubGen, also PubGen Africa on social media. And so you can continue these conversations. So I'm sad that I have to let you go, but it's been really fantastic. And I hope that we will see you again on part 2 of this series. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Alice, and
Thank
thank you, co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.